June 22nd, 2026. Keir Starmer stands at a lectern outside 10 Downing Street and resigns as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
I'm about to visit His Majesty the King to offer my resignation.
He lasted less than 2 years after winning the biggest Labour landslide since 1997. He is the 6th British Prime Minister to resign in 7 years. His successor, Andy Burnham, is the country's 7th Prime Minister in a decade. And the timing is almost poetic. The very next day, June 23rd, marked exactly 10 years since 52% of British voters chose to leave the European Union. 10 years since Vote Leave supporters celebrated in the streets, chanting to take back control. 10 years since Nigel Farage declared that it was Britain's Independence Day. 2 years ago, we made a video on this channel asking a simple question. Was Brexit worth it? Back then, we only had a few years of messy post-Brexit data to work with. Today, we have a full decade. And that decade is not flattering. Since the referendum, the UK economy has grown about 13%, less than half the pace of the United States. Bloomberg estimates Brexit now costs Britain around £100 billion in lost output every single year. Just 30% of folks still think leaving was the right decision. And 6 in 10 now describe Brexit as an outright failure. So today, we are updating our original verdict. We will grade the decade across 3 fronts. 1, trade. 2, money. And 3, the thing Leave voters were promised above everything else, control. This is Brexit, the lost decade. Here is the part of the story that just gets forgotten. Brexit was never one single thing. Britain could have left the EU and stayed in the single market like Norway. It could have kept the customs union like Turkey. Instead, it chose the hardest exit available, which was a full severing of institutional ties with its largest trading partner. Nothing about the referendum required that. Theresa May tried to land a softer version, and her deal died in Parliament 3 separate times. So on December 30th, 2020, Boris Johnson signed the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement and promised that Britain would keep trading freely with Europe while striking better deals with the rest of the world. Sounds great, right? On paper, the deal avoided tariffs on most goods. What it could not avoid was paperwork. The single market worked because borders inside it meant nothing. No customs declarations, no rules of origin checks, no border inspections, no duplicate regulators. The TCA brought all of that back overnight. To see what that looks like in practice, look at Bosch. Before Brexit, the German engineering giant's British arm handled about 40 import transactions a year. Today, it handles 10,000. That is a 250 times increase in customs admin for one company, just to keep doing what it was already doing. Listen, Bosch can absorb that. It has customs brokers and a network of EU subsidiaries. Small businesses have none of those things, and that is exactly where the damage was concentrated. Economists found that the TCA wiped out £27 billion of UK goods exports in 2022 alone. That is a 6.4% drop. Around 16,400 firms that used to sell into the EU simply stopped. The total number of British firms exporting to the EU fell from around 120,000 to around 100,000, and that entire decline came from small companies with fewer than 10 employees. For the smallest fifth of exporters, the value of EU sales dropped 30%. The largest firms were barely touched. And it wasn't just the firms that quit. In the early years of the deal, 8 out of 10 British businesses reported difficulties exporting to the EU at all. The thing you need to understand is the border works like a regressive tax. The bigger you are, the less you feel it. In our original Brexit video, we told you that the British Chambers of Commerce had complained it was easier to trade with distant countries than with Europe. 10 years on, that complaint has hardened into some sort of a business model. The firms that stayed in the EU market did it by opening European warehouses and subsidiaries, moving jobs and tax revenue out of the UK in the process. And plenty of EU buyers looked at the new paperwork and simply switched to suppliers inside the single market. Way less hassle and the same product. Services didn't escape either. The headline numbers held up because consulting and software can just be delivered online. But the regulated sectors where Britain actually dominated, finance and law, lost market access rights that the trade deal just never replaced. There's also a subtler effect that took years to show up in the data. Brexit made British firms less attractive as links in European supply chains. For example, if a German car maker is choosing between a component supplier in Coventry and one in Poland, the one that comes from a custom forum always loses. And once a UK firm falls out of a European supply chain, it loses business with EU and non-EU partners at the same time. And you can see all of it in the national accounts. The Office for Budget Responsibility assumes Brexit leaves UK trade intensity 15% lower than if Britain had remained. Goods exports are running roughly 10 to 15% below where they otherwise would be. Wait, but hold on. Global Britain was supposed to replace all of this with shiny new trade deals. And the deals did kind of arrive. Deals with Australia and New Zealand, membership in the CPTPP Pacific Bloc. Wow, that's a mouthful. And in 2025, the big one, a free trade agreement with India, which enters into force this month. Parliament calls it the most economically significant trade deal Britain has signed since leaving the EU. The government's own impact assessment says it will boost UK GDP by 0.13% in the long run. The OBR says Brexit cut long-run productivity by 4%. At that rate, Britain would need to sign about 30 India-sized deals just to claw its way back to zero. Spoiler alert, there are not 30 Indias. So that is trade. It's a pretty easy one to visualize. The second cost of Brexit was a bit quieter. It's the money that just never showed up. So small businesses have spent the last decade being tracked and processed by a system they just can't opt out of. Here's the uncomfortable part. So are you. While researching these videos, we sign up for dozens of news sites and databases. The result is an inbox full of spam from companies we've never heard of. That is because thousands of data brokers collect and sell your personal information without your knowledge. Your name, your address, your phone number, your browsing habits, your finances, your religious beliefs, etc. That is why we partnered with today's sponsor, Incogni, who we've worked with before. Incogni contacts hundreds of data brokers on your behalf, forces them to delete your data, and keeps checking so it stays deleted. Take a look at my dashboard. Incogni has removed my data from 148 sources so far and keeps working to remove even more. If I did this myself, it would have taken about 111 hours. And if you Google yourself and find your information on a site they don't already cover, the unlimited plan's custom removals has you paste in the link and their privacy experts handle the rest. Visit incogni.com/2in20 and use code 2in20 to get 60% off your annual plan, risk-free for 30 days. Britain spent 10 years trying to take back control. Your data takes about 5 minutes. Link below, and now back to the video. In our original video, we showed that business investment in Britain flatlined the moment the referendum result landed. And it makes sense. Companies hate uncertainty, and between 2016 and 2020, nobody could tell them what Britain's relationship with its largest trading partner would look like. And the question back then was whether the money would come back once the rules were settled. And 10 years on, we finally have the answer. It did not. In 2015, the UK held 8.6% of the world's stock of foreign direct investment, or FDI. By 2025, that had slipped to 7%. And over the same decade, America's share climbed from roughly 20 to 25%. So clearly, global capital kept moving, but the UK was not the destination. And FDI is the kind of money a country actually wants. It builds factories and research labs, and it pushes up wages because foreign-owned firms tend to be way more productive than domestic ones. When it stops arriving, nothing dramatic happens on day one. The damage arrives as a decade of things that never got built. A lost decade, if you will. 2 years ago, economists were already estimating that staying in the EU would have meant about 12 billion more foreign direct investment per year, enough to make Britain the top FDI destination in Europe. And that forecast is best at work in London. When Brexit stopped British banks of their passporting rights into the EU, firms moved around 40,000 jobs to Paris, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and Dublin. And since 2015, Britain has lost market share in 10 of the 12 categories of international finance that analysts track. And London is still a giant, no doubt. But the question is whether that growth had peaked because of Brexit. And remember, finance is the industry the entire UK economy was rebuilt around. When the one sector that carries the country declines, there's no manufacturing base left to catch it. Lower investment is a slow poison. You don't feel it in year 1. You feel it in year 10 when your workers have older machines and less capital behind every hour they work. That is the mechanism behind the OBR's 4% productivity hit. It's also a big part of why British real wages have barely moved in a generation. And if you stack all of these effects together, researchers estimate Brexit has already cut GDP per capita by 6 to 8% by 2025. And you can even see it in the hours worked. British employees worked 4.1% more hours in 2024 than in 2019, but produced only 3.6% more output. What that means is they work harder, but they produce less per hour. If you put a price on all of it, you land on an estimate of around £100 billion a year in lost output. It's crazy because 2 years ago, the running estimate for the total damage was about £160 billion. Cumulative. The estimate now is £100 billion per year, and it compounds. Okay, that was a lot of info. How does it connect to what's actually happening inside the UK right now? So, a smaller economy pays less tax. Less tax means less money to fix an NHS with over 7 million people on waiting lists, less money to build houses, and less room to service a national debt that has climbed to 95.6% of GDP. Britain already pays the highest borrowing costs of any rich OECD country. And none of that is entirely Brexit's fault. But a smaller economy makes every one of those problems harder to solve permanently, and from a starting position, the country chose voluntarily. Now, Brexit's defenders will tell you it was never really an economics project. It was a sovereignty project. Control of the borders and control of the laws. Fine. Let's mark that part of the scorecard too. Let's first take a look at the border because that was the promise that essentially won the referendum. In the year before the vote, net migration to the UK was around 330,000, and that number was treated as a national emergency. Brexit ended free movement, and EU migration collapsed, exactly as promised. Then, the new points-based system, designed entirely in Westminster, may I remind you, blew the doors wide open for everyone else. Net migration hit a record 906,000 in the year to June 2023, nearly triple the level that Leave voters revolted against, delivered by a government elected on a promise to cut it. As a result, the largest arrival groups were from India, Nigeria, and China, mostly students and care workers. Isn't it ironic that Brexit made Britain look less like Europe and more like the Commonwealth? I digress. So what did the politicians do after? Once they realized what they had done, visa rules tightened and salary thresholds jumped, and the numbers went the other way completely. In the year to December 2025, net migration fell 171,000, its lowest level since 2021, with work arrivals from outside the EU down 47% in a single year. So in one decade, Britain went from 330,000 to 906,000 to 171,000. That sounds like a super smart immigration policy to me. Whatever you want to call it, the word is not control. Then there's political control. Let's count the bodies, shall we? David Cameron resigned the morning after the vote. Theresa May spent 3 years trying to pass a Brexit deal, lost her majority, and was forced out by her own party. Boris Johnson got Brexit done, then got done in by his own MPs. Liz Truss lasted 49 days after her mini-budget nearly broke the gilt market. Rishi Sunak led the Conservatives to the worst defeat in their history. And Keir Starmer, the man elected to end the chaos, just resigned before finishing year 2. And the succession for Starmer was arranged with all the subtlety of a Game of Thrones coup. On June 18th, 4 days before Starmer resigned, Andy Burnham won a by-election in Makerfield with a majority of more than 9,200 votes, after a sitting Labour MP resigned his safe seat, basically to hand it to him. From there, the coronation was a formality. Wes Streeting stood aside, nobody else entered the race, and Burnham was elected Labour leader unopposed with the backing of 94% of Labour MPs and all 11 affiliated unions. On July 20th, he walked into Downing Street as Britain's 7th Prime Minister in 10 years. So what does Prime Minister Burnham actually mean? Well, on paper, a sharp left turn. He wants energy, housing, water, and transport brought back under stronger public control. He has floated nationalizing Thames Water, and he wants to raise defense spending through more borrowing. Which sounds bold until you remember the country he is inheriting already pays the highest borrowing cost of any rich OECD nation. So sounds like a great plan. Borrow more in the most expensive debt market in the developed world. On Brexit, Burnham changes the tone, but essentially is keeping the same policy. He's expected to deepen the reset with Brussels, maybe even bring back European Investment Bank money, but rejoining the single market is off the table. The thing is, Burnham is about to discover what the previous 6 PMs discovered. When you become PM, the balance sheet doesn't reset. Math is still math. Okay, there's the elephant in the room. No UK video is a UK video without mention of the most likely winner of the next election. Reform UK, the party that grew directly out of the Brexit campaign, swept the local elections in May and now leads in national polling at 27 to 29%, roughly 9 points clear of both Labour and the Conservatives. Nigel Farage, the man who spent 3 decades campaigning to get Britain out of the EU, is now the most influential politician in the country, despite roughly 2/3 of the public disliking him. And Reform's rise is powered by left-behind regions, the places that voted Leave hardest a decade ago. And Britain is so divided today, it can be seen in polls that the country has run. For example, the share of Britons who say the country is divided by culture wars has surged from 46% in 2020 to 67%. And I'm not in favor of a two-party system, but that is effectively gone. And we can trace that back to the referendum. But the most revealing item on the scorecard is the one that most people really don't talk about. In May 2025, Starmer's government signed a reset agreement with Brussels. Britain agreed to pursue a food and agriculture deal built on dynamic alignment, meaning the UK follows EU rules as they evolve, pays into EU systems, accepts a role for the European Court of Justice, and gets smoother food trade in exchange. It extended EU fishing access in British waters out to 2038, and it opened talks on a capped youth mobility scheme that looks a lot like free movement. Dynamic alignment is a polite phrase for following rules you no longer get to vote on. 10 years after taking back control, Britain is quietly admitting that it doesn't want it because the economics are in such dire circumstances. Today, 50% of them say they would vote to rejoin the EU. Just 31% would vote to stay out. It's funny because Brexit has achieved the one outcome nobody predicted in 2016. It made the EU popular in Britain. Now, none of this means Britain is walking back in. Rejoining would reopen the euro question and the budget bill in a negotiation where those 27 countries, they hold all the leverage. Even the politicians who call Brexit a failure, they're not going to touch the R word. But the direction is unmistakable. Every year, another tiny slice of alignment quietly comes back. 2 years ago, we ended our Brexit video with the verdict. Brexit was a terrible idea. 10 years of data does not change the verdict. And looking back, it was doomed to fail. The 52% voted for a word, not a plan. Brexit meant Norway to some voters, Singapore to others, closed borders to a third camp, and money for the NHS to the rest. A project that means everything to everyone cannot be delivered. The trade promise failed. Britain's share of global capital shrank while its rivals grew. The immigration promise failed. The numbers tripled before they crashed. And the stability promise never stood a chance. The referendum has sacked every prime minister who touched it. And it's not done yet. By the time this video comes out, Andy Burnham will be in his first week or weeks as a prime minister. His pitch is to borrow more and nationalize more in a country that already borrows at the highest rates in the rich world. He will inherit the same debt, the same Brexit. 10 years on, Britain controls its borders, its laws, its trade policy, and its fish. The only thing it can't control is its decline. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a subscribe and check out our free Discord community in the description. Huge shout out to Incogni for sponsoring the video. See you for the next one.